Hey everybody, Shane here, Shoebox Legends. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. This one is going to be kind of a combination video with some hobby thoughts on a topic that I've kind of been turning around in my head of late, along with showing off some great new cards that I've picked up in recent weeks that all kind of fit this overall theme that I've been thinking about. So like many of you, I spend an exorbitant amount of my free time just thinking about the hobby in my head and different approaches and questioning why we do things the way we do things, or if I can look at the hobby from a different angle. And I love those kind of mental exercises to get me to look at the hobby in a different way or consider new avenues for my collection, things like that. And the one that's really been on my mind in recent weeks that I wanted to cover in today's video is the importance of being first. I think we place a pretty big emphasis at times in our hobby on the importance of being first. And I want to kind of explore why that is, or some different ways in which we do that. I will probably have more questions than answers here in this video, but as always, I would love to hear from you, either in the comments or if you're someone who I interact with directly, would love to hear any feedback you have, or if you've given this any thought, because I really enjoy those conversations between collectors. I think they all force us to kind of think outside the box or consider different angles or grow as hobbyists. So the importance of being first, what really got me on this train initially is a Larry Doby card that I picked up recently. And you see in the background here a beautiful 53 Topps Jackie Robinson, which is the first card in the 53 Topps release, very fitting for today's episode. And then across from him, the 51 Bowman Larry Doby, one of my favorite vintage cards from the golden era. And that's not the card I want to talk about today. I picked up a new Doby card, but it just got me thinking, why is it that we prize Jackie Robinson cards and value Jackie Robinson cards so far beyond what we do for Larry Doby? And I think it's because he was first. And I'm not disputing the importance of that. I love Jackie Robinson. This is not a video to devalue his contributions to the game in any way. He's one of the most admirable figures in sports history because he broke the color barrier. And what got me kind of thinking along these lines, I've got this Jackie here that I picked up a few years ago now. This is a mid to late 50s release, standard flagship Topps of Jackie Robinson in a mid-grade. And I should have looked before the video, but my guess is if I were to try to buy this card today, it would be many hundreds of dollars, or maybe even close to a comma card, depending on the overall condition and eye appeal. And the Larry Doby that I landed recently, it's from this same era. It's just a couple of years later. And he was the first player in the American League to break the color barrier, just like Jackie did in the National League. And I understand Jackie beat him by a few weeks, and so he was technically first. But I find it curious that we put such an importance on being first that Larry tends to be a little bit overlooked. And I know this is not new fodder here for conversation by any means, but here's the Larry Doby card that I picked up. Look at this beautiful gem from 1958 Topps. This has got to be the best looking PSA 5 copy of this card I've ever seen. It looks like it just spilled out of a pack. And the reason this kind of got me on the why are we so concerned with who came first train, this card cost me $100 flat. And I don't like to talk about price too often on the channel. It's not the reason I collect, but it's a stark contrast in the hobby and always has been, and even to this day, that a Jackie Robinson card from the same era is going to cost many times what a Larry Doby card is going to cost. So for $100, I had to smash buy it now on this card. I watched this card at $150 for weeks and was tempted to buy it even at that price, but had other kind of hobby things going on, never seemed to get it done. And then finally, the seller reduced the price to $100 flat. And at that point, I just had to buy this card to add to my sort of budding Larry Doby collection. So again, this first topic here is not anything new. It's been widely discussed, and I agree with it. The price discrepancy between Robinson and Doby, and why it is that Robinson gets so much more hobby love when Larry Doby, in his own right, was such a great player and is a fellow Hall of Famer. But I think that recent pickup just really brought it to the forefront of my mind and got me on the path of, why does first matter so much? And then, he couldn't have known it, but as I was already on this topic in my mind, my good buddy Dylan sent me a card. And this is one that I showed in a recent episode, but it's very relevant here, so I want to show it again. It is the 1973 Calbee, card number 7, Sadaharu O. Dylan, who is such a great friend, he sent me this, and it's my first playing era Sadaharu O card. But what I didn't know at the time when I showed this off in a video, and a commenter let me know after the fact that made this card even cooler, 1973 Calbee is the first Calbee release that they did as a brand. So immediately I was like, okay, this is just fantastic. So I reached out to Dylan and was like, did you know that this is the first Calbee release? And he did. And he explained to me that at the beginning of the checklist, they did, I think half a dozen cards for Shigeo Nagashima and half a dozen cards for Sadaharu O, who were basically, the two biggest stars in Nippon professional baseball throughout the 50s and 60s. So it makes sense that they did that. But what I didn't know is the Nagashima cards are 1 through 6 on the checklist. And then I found out the Sadaharu O cards are 7 through 12 on the checklist. So what this means, being card number 7, is that this is literally Sadaharu O's first ever Calbee card. And when I learned that, it just made this gift even cooler to me. I already appreciated Dylan so much for sending that my way and getting me my first kind of true playing era O in my collection. But when I found out that tidbit about it being his literal first Calbee card, it just blew my mind, and I now appreciate that card even more than I did when I first received it. And why is that? It's just because it's the first. And again, I've got more questions and answers here, but I just wonder why we place such an importance on that in our hobby. And then it got me to thinking about first cards from other brands, which, believe it or not, was another topic that I had already been spinning around in my head over the last couple of months, and had picked up what I think are two kind of sneaky cool cards that are directly related to that. And there's something that I feel like many of you may not have considered. And I say that because I've been in the hobby for 18 plus years, and I couldn't name these two cards off the top of my head before I went out and acquired them. I had to do a little bit of research. So just to set the stage for that, I started thinking about first cards in a brand's entire line. And of course, when it comes to Topps, which is the most popular baseball card brand, going all the way back to the early 50s, in my opinion, their first card is the 1951 Topps Redback Yogi Berra. It's card number 1 on the checklist in the very first Topps release. Now, some of you will say, and I don't, strictly disagree with it, you'll reference the 52 Topps Andy Pafko, and that is a card I would like to pick up. I don't own a copy, but I do see the appeal there. I know some collectors, because these are smaller size game cards and they don't have stats on the back, they don't really consider this the first Topps release. I happen to, and I also think Yogi Berra is a more compelling subject than Andy Pafko. So to me, I've always kind of considered this the very first Topps card. And then to go along with that, probably the most famous, at least in my opinion, card to kick off a brand in the history of baseball cards, and bringing this a little bit more into modern, which I love. This is a topic that kind of spans the whole era of baseball card collecting. But in 1989, Upper Deck, when they were launching their new brand of baseball cards, they had to make a decision who is going to be the first player on the checklist, who is going to occupy the first Upper Deck card ever created. And of course, infamously, they could not have chosen better. They took a risk, and they went with somebody who, while he was a highly touted prospect, was definitely an unproven star, of course, at the major league level, Ken Griffey Jr. And what a fortuitous decision that wound up being for Upper Deck. He, of course, turned in a Hall of Fame career, was one of the most exciting and electric players in the hobby and in the game throughout the 90s and into the 2000s. Personally, I would put him on my hobby Mount Rushmore. He was that much of a force in the hobby. As a kid who grew up collecting in the 90s, everybody wanted Griffey cards. And so Upper Deck took a pretty big risk there, and it really paid off. So I'm kind of fascinated by this. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall, sitting around the boardroom at Upper Deck headquarters, maybe in 1988, involved in those discussions of, who do we make the very first player to grace an Upper Deck baseball card. I love that they took a gamble and went with somebody who was basically unproven at the time in the majors. And I love that that gamble paid off and resulted in one of the most iconic cards in the history of our hobby. And then just to link this to the two recent pickups that I made, aside from the Dobie, that are along this same kind of line of thinking, it got me to thinking, who were the other first players to grace some of the major brands that we know and appreciate as baseball card collectors. And the two that I was drawn to most were the 1981 Fleer and 1981 Donruss releases, because a lot of collectors, and I understand, draw the line at vintage being 1980 and older. And a major reason for that is because in 1981, of course, the hobby landscape expanded. Donruss and Fleer entered the game, and Topps had some competition for really the first time in more than 25 years, ever since Bowman was kind of stamped out of existence in the mid-50s. So I immediately became curious, what were the very first cards released by Donruss and Fleer? What was card number one on their 1981 checklists? Because I think those cards are kind of significant as far as this theme goes, in the same way that the Yogi Berra and the Ken Griffey Jr. Upper Deck card are. And I found, I tried to challenge myself in my head at first to see if I could name them or picture them without doing any research. And even though I've been back in the hobby for, 18 years now, I couldn't tell off the top of my head who subject number one was on the 81 Fleer or Donruss checklist. So I looked into it. It was fascinating, and I ended up picking up a high-graded copy of each of the two cards because I think they're a perfect fit for my collection in the same way that the Yogi and the Griffey are. And we're going to start with Donruss because they made a move that was very similar to me to what Upper Deck did in 89. They had a choice to make here. Who's going to be subject number one on card number one? And they could have gone with an established veteran, somebody who is a lock for the Hall of Fame. But instead, they took kind of a similar route that Upper Deck did later in the decade. And they went with a very young player who is still yet to really prove himself or be a surefire thing as far as the Hall of Fame or being an all-time great. And here it is, 1981 Donruss. Card number one is none other than Ozzie Smith. So they chose the great shortstop at the time for the Padres, and then more famously later for the Cardinals, as the subject of their very first licensed baseball card, card number one in the 81 Donruss release. And I found out this is actually a sneaky tough card to get in a high grade as well. Fascinated by kind of these early 80s releases and kind of the quality control and how some of these were just really off-center, had tons of issues, condition issues and printing issues as these brands were kind of finding their way. And so I looked up the pop report on these, and out of about 400 plus cards that have been graded in terms of 1981 Donruss Ozzie Smiths, only I think 150 or less of them are a PSA 9 or 10. So just about maybe roughly 1 in 3 copies that have been submitted have gotten like a mint or a gem mint grade from PSA. All other copies have been an 8 or lower. So you have about a 2/3 chance historically of getting an 8 or lower on these. So I thought it was really cool. Found this beautifully centered, extremely good condition PSA 9. Really happy to add this one to my collection. And I think it's a really fun tie between this card in particular and the 89 Upper Deck Griffey in terms of two brands that took a risk. Ozzie had only been in the league for like 2-3 seasons at this point. And while he certainly appeared destined for greatness, was definitely a star fielder already, there was no guarantee, as any of us know that watch the game, that he would go on to have the type of Hall of Fame, all-time great career that he did. And in both these cases, I think that risk paid off. Obviously, the Donruss card, not nearly as iconic as the 89 Upper Deck Griffey, as evidenced by the fact that I didn't even know off the top of my head who the subject was for card number one in 81 Donruss, but happy to have figured it out, happy to have landed this copy, and I love the tie and the link between these two cards. And then the other brand, just to close out the video that I touched on, who also expanded the baseball card hobby landscape in 1981 was Fleer. And I found it fascinating that the folks at Fleer, when they were sitting around trying to make this determination on their checklist, who would represent the brand sort of coming out of the gate, they went in a very similar direction as Topps did in 1951. Topps made sort of a safe choice here with Yogi Berra. Yes, he was earlier in his career, maybe similar to an Ozzie Smith, but he'd already won, World Series championships and was the catcher for the greatest franchise, in the sport, who was just dominating at that point. And so I think he was a pretty safe bet. Well, Fleer in 1981, they went with an even safer bet. And they went with baseball's all-time hit king, the great Pete Rose. Check this card out. Having a little bit of a focus issue there, but Great card here of Pete Rose, a player who I admire so much. Don't have nearly enough of him in my collection. I would love to add more Pete Rose. And so this experiment and doing this research kind of became the perfect reason to go out and land a high-grade copy of this Pete Rose. Now, this is not nearly as tough a card condition-wise as the 81 Donruss Ozzie Smith. So this was had for a fraction of the price. Neither of these were expensive cards, but I want to say this Pete Rose was maybe $30 or something like that. And there are definitely more of these in a 9 or 10 than there are the Ozzie. But I admire this choice by Fleer as well. I think it's kind of ironic that they chose an all-time great who would later, kind of be banned and blackballed by both the sport and then in turn the hobby. But of course, you can't fault them for choosing Pete at the time, one of the most dynamic and exciting players in the game, and somebody who had not long after this set came out become baseball's all-time hit king. Just an absolute no-brainer decision, and I think it is kind of fitting and pairs up nicely with this Yogi Berra. So that's kind of all my recent thoughts on the importance of being first. A couple of new cards that I thought it was kind of neat to track down that I had never given any thought to previously. And it just kind of shows that there are a million different avenues and inroads that we can go down in this hobby. Even someone who's been in the hobby for multiple decades like myself, there are always new angles, new approaches, new ways to consider your collecting. And yeah, I've been really pleased with this importance of firsts wavelength that I've been on. And then again, when Dylan sent me that Sadaharu O, and I found out that it was his very first Calby card, all of this just kind of came together, and I thought it would make interesting subject matter for today's video. So didn't mean to ramble on for 17 minutes here. I really appreciate it if you've stuck with me throughout this one. I know there's a lot of content out there and your time is valuable, but I really appreciate the support. I'll be back soon, as you know, with some more content. And until then, just keep enjoying the hobby, everybody. See ya.